The story of the great family. The desert is a dangerous place. It's always moving. It's hard to know where you are. And there's very little water. Almost nothing grows there, so there's really nothing to eat. When the wind blows, the sand can hurt you, strike your skin. And in the daytime, it's very hot. But at night, it can become quite cold. People wear many clothes in the desert to protect them from the sun and from the beating sand. The desert is a dangerous place. And people don't go out into the desert unless they have to. When the flood was over, the creatures went out in all four directions of the earth to fill it up. They often gathered along the rivers. People lived in small villages and then cities. And one of the greatest cities was the city of Ur. In the city of Ur, people believed that there were many gods. There were gods for every rock and tree, for the sky, for the wind, for the water. But there was one family who believed that all of God was in every place. They did not know that yet, but it's what they believed. Abram and Sarai were part of that family. The family decided it was time to move to a new place, the city of Haran. So they packed up their belongings and they traveled along the Euphrates River with all of their sheep and goats, with their family members, old and young. At night, they would set up tents along the river. And during the day, they would walk along the river as a guide to the city of Haran. They knew where they were getting close when they started meeting other people along the way. And it took a long time. Sometimes Abram would go out into the desert by himself. And God would come close to Abram. And Abram would get close to God, so close to God that he knew what God wanted him to do. So once they arrived in Haran, Abram knew this was not where God wanted them to stay. So along with Abram's brother's son, Lot, Sarai and Abram continued to travel towards Canaan. Finally, they came to a place called Shechem. Abram climbed a hill and prayed to God, and God was there. And so Abram built an altar to mark the place at Shechem. Next, they continued on their travels towards Canaan. And they came to a place called Bethel. And again, God was there when Abram prayed. And Abram built an altar to mark this place. And that's when they knew that God was not just here or there. He was everywhere. All of God was everywhere. And they continued on their travels till they reached the Oaks of Mamre. And that is where they settled. One night, God brought Abram out to the edge of the desert. He looked up to the sky, and God came so close to Abram. And Abram came so close to God that Abram knew what God was saying. You will be a father, the father of a great family, and Sarai will be the mother. The members of that great family will be as many as the stars in the sky and the grains of sand in the desert. And Abram laughed. He and Sarai were very old, and God's promise sounded impossible. But God said to change their names anyway. So Abram became Abraham, and Sarai was to be called Sarah. One day, 3 strangers came from the desert. And Abram was sitting by his tent, and he invited them in. And Sarai mixed 3 measures of flour, which is a lot. And she gave them bread and meat and milk and water to drink, as was their custom. And they told Abram that he and Sarai would soon have a son. And Abram laughed, and Sarah, who was nearby, heard them and laughed also. They were too old. But you know what happened? The 3 strangers went on their way, and Abram and Sarah had a son. So they named the baby Laughter, which in their language is Isaac. When the boy was grown, Sarai died. And she was buried in a cave near the oaks. Abram was sad and lonely, and he missed Sarah very much, but he had one more thing to do. He sent his most trusted helper back to the land of his people to help find a wife for Isaac. His helper stopped by a well in the evening, and Rebekah offered to give him some water to drink. She then helped him give water to his animals. She was as full of courage as she was kind. Rebekah then invited him to her home, and he told her family about Abraham and Sarah and the great family. And Rebekah decided she would want to be part of that great family. So she went across the desert, past Shechem, and past Bethel, towards Hebron. Isaac saw them coming and came out to meet them. And he and Rebekah were married. Now Abraham was very old and full of years, and he died and was buried next to Sarah near the oaks of Hebron. Then Isaac and Rebekah had children, and their children had children, and their children had children. And this went on for many thousands and thousands of years until your grandmother and grandfathers had children. Then your mothers and fathers had children. And now you are part of this great family, which has become as many as the stars in the sky or the grains of sand in the desert.